She has nothing but an ordinary dress and a face full of quiet ambition. Her marrying into the Ashworth family is not a union, it is a transaction, and a deeply dissatisfying one at that. In the grand, gilded ballroom of the Astoria, these were the whispers that slithered between champagne flutes and saccharine smiles. The groom, Spencer Ashworth, stood near the marble archway, adjusting his bow tie for the 10th time, letting the venomous words of his kin wash over the bride to be his future wife, as if she were nothing more than a statue placed there for their amusement. The assembled guests, a curated audience of old money and sharp-edged power, treated the brewing humiliation as the day's first entertainment. But the woman at the center of their scorn, Elara Vance, did not crumble. She did not weep. She stood with a stillness that was both unnerving and profound, her posture a silent refutation of their judgment. Her strength wasn't in a fiery retort, but in the deliberate, almost imperceptible calm that settled over her like a shroud. She was a storm gathering in silence, and they were all too busy admiring the lightning to hear the thunder rolling in from the distance. The day had begun, not with the pop of champagne, but with the quiet hum of the city waking below. Elara sat on the edge of a king-sized bed in a hotel suite that was tasteful and elegant, yet starkly simple compared to the opulence the Ashworths inhabited. Her wedding dress hung from a wooden hanger against the door, bathed in the soft, gray light of dawn. It was a creation of ivory silk crepe, with a clean, sculptural silhouette. It had no lace, no beading, no ostentatious train that screamed for attention. Its beauty was in its structure, its flawless lines, and the quiet confidence it exuded. She had chosen it herself, a decision that had caused the first of many ripples. Her father, Julian Vance, a man who had built a tech empire from a garage and still saw the world in terms of bold, disruptive statements, had wanted her in something grand. Something that tells them who you are, Ellie, he had argued, his voice laced with protective pride. It does, Dad, she had replied softly, running her hand over the smooth fabric. It tells them I am Elara, not Elara Vance, the billionaire's daughter, just Elara. He had eventually conceded, his shrewd eyes recognizing the same unyielding core in his daughter that had propelled him to the zenith of the corporate world. Now, alone in her room, she smoothed the dress with her hands, her fingers lingering on the fabric. She took a slow, deep breath, holding it until her lungs ached, then releasing it in a controlled sigh. Outside, the sounds of New York began their daily symphony, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a subway, the impatient honking of a taxi. She didn't know it yet, but the memory of that single, grounding breath would become her anchor in the storm to come. She had learned long ago to pick her battles. Growing up in the shadow of a titan like Julian Vance, she had been taught discipline, restraint, and the kind of unshakable strength that doesn't need to announce itself. His voice echoed in her mind, a memory from her childhood when she was a small girl with pigtails, perched on the edge of his massive mahogany desk. He had been staring at a hostile takeover bid on his monitor, his face like granite. He turned to her and said, his voice a low rumble, "Never let them see you flinch, Elara. Let them throw their stones. You just keep building your foundation. Stronger, quieter." She had never forgotten it. Zipping her simple overnight bag, she checked her reflection in the full-length mirror. Her face was bare, save for a touch of makeup that enhanced rather than masked. Her dark hair was styled in a simple, elegant chignon at the nape of her neck. She looked like herself. That was her only goal for the day. It was, she knew, an act of rebellion. The first overt act of war was declared before she even reached the venue. The Ashworth family had, of course, arranged the transportation. A fleet of gleaming black vehicles idled by the hotel's curb, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Maybachs, each one a statement of obscene wealth. They were for the Ashworths and their esteemed guests. When Elara stepped out of the lobby, a driver in a stiff, gray uniform, his face a mask of practiced indifference, gestured towards the end of the line. There, tucked away behind the shining beasts of luxury, was a dark blue sedan. It was clean, but undeniably ordinary, the kind of car one rents for a quick trip to the airport, not the kind that carries a bride to her wedding at the Astoria. Its model was several years old, and a faint scratch ran along the passenger side door. The other cars, engines purring with aristocratic disdain, peeled away from the curb, carrying the Ashworth clan in their cocoon of tinted windows and polished chrome. Ilara's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, an appetizer for the main course of humiliation they had planned. She gave the driver a small, polite nod and slid into the back of the sedan. The leather seat was cracked, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. The driver didn't look at her in the rearview mirror. He didn't say a word. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with unspoken contempt. As they pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel, the scene was already a media frenzy. Guests were milling about on the steps, their designer outfits a kaleidoscope of color. Phones were held high, flashing like a swarm of fireflies. As Ilara stepped out of the modest sedan, a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. A woman dripping in diamonds and wrapped in a fur shawl, despite the mild autumn air, leaned towards her friend and laughed, her voice sharp and carrying. "Is that the bride? In that thing? I thought the Vances had money." Ilara heard it. She was meant to. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the ornate doors of the venue, her father's words a shield around her heart. Never let them see you flinch. Genevieve Ashworth was waiting for her at the entrance, a predator poised in her natural habitat. She was a woman sculpted from ice and ambition, her ash-blonde hair styled in a flawless chignon, her couture gown shimmering with what was likely the GDP of a small nation. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, all warmth on the surface and Arctic ice beneath. She played the part of the gracious mother-in-law to perfection, but her eyes, cold and calculating, gave her away. They swept over Ilara's simple dress with a flicker of triumph before her mask of affection snapped back into place. She took Ilara's arm, her grip surprisingly firm, a gesture less of welcome and more of possession. She guided her through the throng of onlookers, raising her voice just enough to be heard by those nearby, her tone dripping with feigned sympathy. "Oh, my dear," she cooed, her voice like honey laced with arsenic, "you must feel so overwhelmed. Coming from a world of, well, a different world, all of this must be quite a shock to the system." The guests chuckled. They interpreted it as a sweet, motherly concern for a simple girl thrust into the stratosphere of high society. They saw a narrative they understood, the wide-eyed newcomer being guided by the benevolent matriarch. But Ilara understood the true meaning. Genevieve wasn't welcoming her. She was branding her. She was marking her as an outsider, an imposter, a lesser being who should be grateful for the privilege of breathing Ashworth air. Ilara stopped. She turned her head slightly, her calm, dark eyes meeting Genevieve's cold, blue ones. The polite smile on her lips did not waver. "I am exactly where I need to be, Mrs. Ashworth," she said. Her voice was soft, yet it carried an unexpected weight, cutting through the ambient chatter like a shard of glass. It was not defiant, not angry, but it was firm. It was the voice of someone who knew her own ground. For the briefest of moments, Genevieve's perfectly constructed smile faltered. A flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by irritation, crossed her features before being expertly smoothed away. The small crowd around them fell silent, the dynamic shifting in a way they couldn't quite comprehend. This wasn't the flustered, grateful girl they had been expecting. As Ilara moved towards the venue's grand staircase, a man in a velvet blazer, a well-known art dealer with a reputation for a tongue as sharp as his suits, deliberately stepped into her path. He looked her up and down, a theatrical, insulting appraisal, his lip curling into a sneer. "My dear," he said, his voice booming with condescension, clearly performing for the audience gathering around them. "This isn't a backyard barbecue. You're embarrassing the Ashworths with that minimalist ensemble." The crowd snickered, their phones once again rising, eager to capture her reaction, to document her humiliation for their social media feeds. Ilara's hand rested lightly on the polished marble banister, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth stone. She did not blush or look away. She met his gaze directly, her own expression unreadable. "Embarrassment," she stated, her voice as clear and cool as the marble beneath her hand, "comes from cruelty, not from clothes." The man's smirk vanished as if wiped away. His hand, holding a flute of champagne, tightened, the knuckles turning white. The crowd's laughter died in their throats, replaced by an uncomfortable murmur. He had expected tears or a flustered retort. He had not expected to be so cleanly and publicly dissected. Alara held his gaze for another second before turning and ascending the stairs, her steps measured and even. She left a ripple of unease in her wake. They had come for a public shaming, but the intended victim refused to play her part. The inside of the ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle, a testament to the Ashworths' boundless wealth and exquisite, if cold, taste. Thousands of white orchids and roses cascaded from the ceiling, and the air was thick with their cloying perfume. Waiters glided through the room with trays of champagne and canapes, and a string quartet played Vivaldi in a distant corner. It was a perfect, glittering cage. Alara moved through it all, a solitary island of calm in a sea of judgment. She felt their eyes on her, heard the whispers that followed her like a shadow. Who let her in? She looks like she's here to clean the place. A hedge fund manager with slick-back hair muttered to his date, who giggled into her glass. Alara's hand, resting on her simple clutch, paused. Her fingers brushed against the zipper, a small, unconscious movement. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. Her father's words again. Let them throw their stones. Their words were nothing more than pebbles against a fortress wall. She was beginning to understand that her silence was more powerful than any retort she could offer. It confused them. It denied them the satisfaction of a reaction. As she neared the private room set aside for her before the ceremony, a young woman in a glittering, sequined dress, one of Genevieve's many cousins, blocked her path. She was all sharp cheekbones and sharper words, her voice pitched to carry. "Sweetie, you're not actually walking down the aisle in that, are you? It looks like something you'd find in a thrift store." The familiar titter of laughter from the surrounding guests followed the remark. Alara paused, her head tilted just so. "It's not the dress that makes the bride," she said, her voice even and low. "It's the commitment." The cousin blinked, her practiced smirk faltering. The comeback was too poised, too intelligent. It didn't fit the narrative of the simple, out-of-her-depth girl they had all agreed upon. Alara stepped past her, her movement as smooth and fluid as the silk of her dress, leaving the girl speechless. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. This quiet confidence was not what they had signed up for. They had expected a melodrama, a tragedy. What they were getting was a masterclass in quiet power, and they didn't know what to make of it at all. Alara reached the door to her room, her hands steady on the brass handle. The first act was over. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the worst was yet to come. The private room designated for the bride was another of Genevieve Ashworth's carefully curated statements. It was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with a chaise lounge upholstered in velvet and a vanity mirror framed with theatrical bulbs. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly devoid of warmth. It felt less like a bridal suite and more like a gilded holding cell, a place where the final touches were to be put on the family's newest, most valuable acquisition. Alara stood before the mirror, not to admire her reflection, but to center herself, drawing on that inner reservoir of calm she had so painstakingly built over the years. The murmurs of the crowd outside were a dull roar, a distant ocean of contempt. She adjusted the simple, translucent veil that was her only concession to bridal tradition, her movements slow and deliberate. The door opened without a knock. A young woman, one of Genevieve's assistants, rushed in. She was a flurry of nervous energy, her smile stretched too wide, her perfume cloying and aggressive. She carried a silver tray with 2 glasses of what looked like cranberry juice. "Mrs. Ashworth thought you might be thirsty." "Miss Vance," the assistant chirped, her eyes darting everywhere but at Alara. Alara's gaze remained fixed on the mirror, watching the scene unfold in reflection. She saw the girl's calculated path, the way her ankles seemed to twist at an unnatural angle just as she drew near. It was a clumsy, poorly executed piece of theater. The assistant let out a small, unconvincing cry as she tripped. The tray tilted, and one of the glasses arced through the air, its contents a vibrant, blood-red splash against the pristine ivory silk of Alara's dress. The stain bloomed instantly, a garish wound on the fabric, spreading from her hip down the length of the skirt. As if on cue, Genevieve was there in an instant, her hands flying to her face in a gesture of exaggerated shock. "Oh, my dear child, what a terrible, terrible accident," she gasped, her voice a symphony of false pity. The assistant, having played her part, stammered a string of apologies, her face a mask of manufactured panic as she backed away. The door, conveniently left ajar, was now filled with the prying eyes of guests. Their whispers were no longer a dull roar but sharp, piercing daggers. "My God, she can't even keep her dress clean for the ceremony. How utterly clumsy. What kind of a bride is this?" The Ashworths must be mortified. Genevieve lapped up their reactions, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction even as her mouth formed words of consolation. This was the masterstroke, she believed. This would break the girl's composure. A stained dress was a visible, undeniable mark of failure, a symbol of her unworthiness. But Alara did not gasp. She did not flinch. She simply stood still for a moment, her hands steady, her gaze dropping from the mirror to the ugly red stain on her gown. Then, without a word, she reached down to a nearly invisible seam at her waist. With a series of deft, practiced movements, she unhooked the soiled outer skirt, letting the stained fabric fall to the floor in a silken pool. Underneath was a second layer. It was an exquisitely tailored sheath dress made of delicate, shimmering lace, catching the light as she moved. It was not a backup plan. It was the plan. She had walked into this lion's den, knowing she would not emerge unscathed. She had designed the dress this way, anticipating their malice, turning their weapon back on them. The room, which had been buzzing with malicious gossip, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The guests in the doorway stared, their mouths agape. It was as if she had performed a magic trick. One woman whispered to her companion, her voice tinged with a newfound awe. It's like she knew." Genevieve's mouth twitched, the triumphant smile dying on her lips. Her perfect plan had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, revealing Alara not as a clumsy victim, but as a brilliant strategist, always 2 steps ahead. Alara stepped forward, away from the discarded fabric, the new silhouette of her gown shimmering under the lights. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the shocked faces in the doorway. She simply held her head high and moved towards the aisle, her steps steady and unwavering, leaving her future mother-in-law standing amidst the wreckage of her own petty scheme. The wedding march began, its triumphant chords sounding almost ironic in the thick, tense air. The crowd's demeanor had shifted. The open mockery had been replaced by a wary, grudging respect. They were no longer just watching a girl from New Money. They were watching a formidable player in a game they were only just beginning to understand. Spencer was waiting at the altar, his handsome face pale and slick, with a thin sheen of sweat. His hands fidgeted with his cufflinks, a nervous tic that betrayed the weakness beneath his polished exterior. He saw the stained fabric still lying on the floor of the anteroom. He saw the crowd's stunned reaction, and he saw Alara approaching him, radiant and unbroken. He said nothing. When she reached his side, his only acknowledgement was a weak, whispered, "It's fine, dear." Alara looked at him then, truly looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for something. Anything a flicker of defiance on her behalf, a spark of loyalty, a hint of the man she had spent months believing he could be. But he wouldn't meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on a point just over her shoulder, on his father, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. In that moment, Alara knew she was utterly alone. Before the officiant could begin, a man in a pinstriped suit stood up from the front row. He was a distant Ashworth relative, with a loud voice and an even louder ego. He raised his champagne glass, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "A toast to the bride," he boomed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Who clearly knows how to make an entrance, even if it's in a dress that looks like it's been through a battle." A wave of laughter, some nervous, others cruel, rippled through the guests. Spencer flinched beside her but remained silent. Ilara's fingers tightened on her small bouquet of white calla lilies, the stems digging into her palm. She turned slightly, just enough to face the man, her expression serene. "A dress doesn't make a marriage," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent hall. "Loyalty does." The man's grin froze, his glass still held aloft. The laughter choked off, and he sank back into his seat, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with an unspoken tension. The ceremony finally started, and the third, most intimate insult was delivered. It was time for the vows. The officiant smiled kindly at Spencer, who cleared his throat and began to read from a card his father had pressed into his hand just minutes earlier. The words were all wrong. "I, Spencer Corbin Ashworth," he began, his voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear, "vow to honor the dignity and traditions of the Ashworth family, and to bring you, Alara, into our fold, to guide you in our ways." The guests clapped politely, assuming it was a sweet, if somewhat archaic, nod to family pride. But Alara's hands, holding the bouquet, began to tremble ever so slightly. These were not the vows they had written together, the ones they had spent nights whispering over the phone, full of promises of partnership, respect, and shared dreams. These were the words of an acquisition, a contract of ownership. She glanced at Genevieve, who was seated in the front row, smiling serenely, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her microphone, pinned to her dress for the videographer, was still on. As she leaned toward a friend beside her, her voice, a low, triumphant whisper, was picked up and amplified throughout the grand hall. A faint electronic squeal was followed by her amplified words, clear as a bell in the hushed room. "Cheap trash. You think you can escape us?" The sound hit the room like a sonic boom of scandal. A collective gasp swept through the guests. Heads whipped around to stare at Genevieve, whose face had gone completely white with horror as she realized what had happened. People began whispering furiously, some even standing to get a better look at the unfolding drama. But amidst the chaos, Alara Vance went completely still. The slight tremble in her hands ceased. The pained, searching look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, hard clarity. It was the final stone. It was the final piece of evidence. It was the final insult she would endure. She had given them every chance to show a shred of decency, and they had responded with nothing but contempt. The storm, gathering in silence all day, was finally ready to break. The air in the grand hall was thick with the fallout from Genevieve's broadcasted whisper. The ceremony concluded in a haze of forced smiles and frantic, hushed conversations. The officiant, sensing the deep fracture that had just occurred, rushed through the final pronouncements. Spencer, looking ghostly and insubstantial, placed a ring on Alara's finger. It felt cold and foreign, a manacle, not a promise. She did not reciprocate. When he leaned in for the customary kiss, she turned her head just slightly so his lips brushed against her cheek. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but to him it felt like a slap. To the audience, it was yet another sign that this union was already a catastrophe. The transition to the reception was a somber affair. The string quartet played on, but their cheerful melodies were a discordant soundtrack to the palpable tension. Guests moved to their tables, but the celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by a morbid, voyeuristic curiosity. They were no longer at a wedding. They were spectators at a public execution, and they were all wondering who would be the next to fall. The Ashworths, ever the masters of appearances, attempted to salvage the evening. Corbin strode around, clapping men on the back, his laughter a little too loud. Genevieve, having recovered her composure, glided between tables, explaining away her unfortunate technical glitch with a dismissive wave of her hand. But her eyes, whenever they chanced upon Alara, were chips of pure, unadulterated ice. Alara sat at the head table, a portrait of unnerving serenity. She ate nothing, drank nothing. She simply watched, her gaze sweeping over the room, cataloging every nervous glance, every whispered comment, every false smile. She saw Spencer at her side, desperately trying to engage her in conversation, his voice a low, pleading murmur. "Alara, please, we can fix this. It was just a misunderstanding." She did not answer him. She did not even look at him. To her, he had become a ghost, a hollow outline of the man she had once cared for. The love, the hope, the future she had envisioned, all of it, had been systematically poisoned and had died right there at the altar. What remained was not anger, but a cold, clear, and absolute resolve. Then came the final, most audacious assault. The grand screens positioned around the ballroom, which were meant to display a romantic slideshow of the couple's journey, flickered to life. But it wasn't photos of Spencer and Alara on a beach or sharing a coffee. It was a video. The footage was grainy, clearly sourced from security cameras and surreptitiously filmed phone recordings. It showed Alara in various settings over the past few months. Here she was, laughing at a business lunch, her arm brushing against a male colleague's as they looked over a document. There she was, in a hotel lobby after a late-night meeting, her head close to the same man's as he spoke, the angle making the conversation look conspiratorially intimate. The clips were spliced together, stripped of context, and set to a somber, suggestive piano score. The implication was clear, brutal, and utterly false. The bride was unfaithful. A collective gasp filled the ballroom, a sound of unified shock and scandal. "She's cheating!" A woman in a sequin dress hissed, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. The press, who had been relegated to a corner of the room, surged forward, their cameras flashing, turning the moment into a feeding frenzy. Genevieve stood, her hand flying to her heart, her face a perfect mask of horror and betrayal. "Oh no," she cried, her voice trembling for all to hear. "It can't be." But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, gleamed with the unmistakable light of victory. This was her checkmate. No amount of poise or clever comebacks could defend against this. This was a public branding, an indelible stain on Alara's character. Corbin Ashworth allowed himself a small, smug smile as he watched his son's face. Spencer froze, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from the screen to Alara, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Amidst the chaos, the whispers, the flashing lights, Alara Vance remained perfectly still. Her back was straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't gasp, she didn't cry. She didn't shout denials. She watched the fabricated narrative of her infidelity play out on the screens, her face an unreadable, placid mask. The pain was there, a sharp, piercing thing in her chest, but it was a cold pain now, a fuel that solidified her resolve into something as hard and unbreakable as diamond. She had expected this. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the sentiment. She had known they would not stop until they had tried to break her completely. And in their final, desperate act of cruelty, they had given her the one thing she needed: justification. Her movements were slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. She did not look at Spencer, who was now babbling her name. She did not look at Genevieve, who was basking in her perceived triumph. She reached into the small, elegant clutch by her plate. The room held its breath. Were they about to witness a complete breakdown? She withdrew her phone. The sleek, black device seemed impossibly modern and powerful in the gilded, old-world opulence of the ballroom. It looked like a weapon. Her thumb moved across the screen with a steady, unhurried grace. She wasn't fumbling. She wasn't frantic. She was executing a command. She found the number in her contacts, pressed it, and then touched the small icon for the speakerphone. The electronic chime of the call connecting cut through the buzzing of the crowd. A single ring, then another. The entire room was silent, leaning in, straining to hear. Then, a voice answered. It was a deep, calm voice, heavy with an authority that needed no introduction. It was the voice of a man who moved markets with a single word, a man whose name was synonymous with power and innovation. Alara, the voice of Julian Vance, rumbled through the ballroom's sound system. "Is something wrong, my daughter?" Every head turned, every jaw dropped. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it was annihilated and remade in that single moment. The Ashworths were no longer the lions. They were gazelles who had just heard the roar of a creature far older and more powerful than they could possibly comprehend. Alara lifted the phone slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a wronged bride or a hysterical woman. It was the voice of a CEO giving a final, irrevocable order. It was clear, steady, and devoid of all emotion. "Father," she said, the word echoing in the cavernous hall. "Cancel the $1.5 billion deal with the Ashworths." Immediately, a wave of pure, unadulterated shock rolled through the room. Corbin Ashworth's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, crumpled. "No," he breathed, starting to rise from his chair, his hand outstretched as if he could physically stop her words. But it was already too late. As if commanded by an invisible hand, the screens behind her flickered. The slanderous video vanished. For a terrifying second, the screens were black. Then, a new image blazed to life, illuminating the entire ballroom. It was a simple, stark document, the official letterhead of Vance Industries. The text was large, the critical phrases highlighted, but all anyone could see were the two words at the bottom, stamped in colossal, blood-red letters that seemed to burn into the very air. Contract terminated. A single glass shattered somewhere in the back of the room, the sound like a gunshot in the dead silence. Corbin Ashworth collapsed back into his chair, his face the color of ash. He looked as though he had been punched, all the air and arrogance knocked out of him in one devastating blow. Genevieve stood frozen, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of a chair, her mask of composure finally, irrevocably shattered. Her mouth hung open, a silent scream trapped in her throat. And Spencer finally looked at Alara, truly looked at her. The quiet, accommodating woman he thought he was marrying was gone. In her place sat a queen upon a throne of ruin, her face calm, her eyes holding the cold, distant light of a dying star. He was not looking at his bride. He was looking at the architect of his family's utter and complete downfall. The red words on the screen pulsed like a heartbeat, the final, thundering beat of the Ashworth dynasty. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vacuum, filled with the weight of a fallen empire. The guests were frozen, their faces a gallery of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrified respect for the woman seated at the head table. The reporters, sensing the story of a lifetime, erupted into a frenzy, their cameras flashing relentlessly, not on the disgraced family, but on the avenging angel who had orchestrated their demise with a single phone call. Spencer stumbled forward, his handsome face contorted in a desperate, pathetic plea. He grabbed for Alara's hand, his touch an unwelcome violation. "Alara, please," he begged, his voice cracking, the sound pitifully thin in the cavernous room. "Don't do this. Think about us. No one else will take you now." The last words were a final, reflexive jab, a desperate attempt to wound her, to remind her of her supposed place. Alara looked down at his hand on hers, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. There was no anger left in her gaze, only a profound and weary pity. "You are mistaken, Spencer," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "The question was never who would take me. The question was who I would accept." Genevieve, trembling with a rage that made her face an ugly, mottled mask, finally found her voice. "You little witch!" she shrieked, her carefully cultivated accent dissolving into a shrill, raw sound. "If you walk out that door, society will laugh at you forever. You'll be a pariah." Corbin, his face gray and slack, could only mutter, $1.5 billion. You would cancel a deal that size over personal spite? Alara slowly, deliberately, pulled her hand from Spencer's grasp. She stood, her movements fluid and graceful, the shimmering lace of her dress catching the chaotic light of the camera flashes. She looked at the three of them, the broken patriarch, the venomous matriarch, and the hollow shell of the man she had almost married. She saw them not as giants, but as small, petty people, shrunken by their own cruelty. Then, in a final symbolic act, she slipped the heavy diamond ring from her finger. It was the Ashworth family heirloom, a piece they had lorded over her as a symbol of her entry into their world. She walked to the altar, now a stage for her final performance, and placed the ring gently on the white lace cloth. It glittered under the lights, a beautiful, lonely, and now meaningless object. She turned to face the room, to face them all one last time. "I would rather be whispered about for a day," she announced, her voice resonating with a power that commanded the attention of every soul in the room, than be despised by myself for a lifetime. With that, she turned her back on the wreckage of their lives and began to walk away. "You're a fraud," a young photographer shouted, egged on by a desperate, silent nod from Genevieve. "You're just a gold digger who tricked her way in." The accusation hung in the air. Alara stopped at the grand ballroom doors, her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around completely, just glanced back over her shoulder, a final, parting shot. "A fraud hides," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "But I have been right here, in plain sight, all along." She pushed the door open and walked out, not into darkness, but into a blinding sea of camera flashes and shouting reporters. She didn't flinch. She kept walking, her head held high, her father's words a triumphant echo in her heart. Behind her, the ballroom erupted. The illusion of civility was shattered. Guests were on their feet, some rushing for the exits, others crowding around the Ashworths, their whispers turning into open condemnations. The live stream, which had captured every horrifying moment, was going viral, spreading across the internet like a digital wildfire. The news was already breaking. Ashworth, Vance mega, deal collapses amidst wedding scandal. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By morning, the Ashworths were not just disgraced, they were radioactive. An emergency board meeting was called, and by noon, Corbin Ashworth had been unceremoniously fired from the company his great-grandfather had founded. Leaked emails, unearthed by a vengeful board member, proved he had known about the fabricated video and had even paid for it to be edited. Genevieve's name became a toxic punchline in high society. Her charity galas were canceled as sponsors pulled out in droves. A grainy photo of her whispering cheap trash became a viral meme, a symbol of aristocratic cruelty. Spencer vanished from the public eye, his social media accounts flooded with thousands of comments mocking his weakness. He was last seen at a downtown bar a week later, alone, staring into an empty glass. Their empire, built on a foundation of image and intimidation, had crumbled to dust because they had underestimated the quiet strength of one woman. Alara didn't read the news. She didn't need to. She was at her father's estate in Napa Valley, sitting on a sprawling porch overlooking rows of grapevines. The air smelled of rain and rich earth. She wore simple jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, a cup of coffee warming her hands. She had always loved this time of year, the way it felt like the world was shedding its skin, preparing for a quiet, necessary rest before starting anew. A groundskeeper walked by, tipped his hat, and said, "Good to have you home, Miss Vance." She nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She didn't need to say anything more. She had spoken her truth, and the world was now doing the work for her. Months later, she was in a small, independent bookstore in San Francisco, the kind with mismatched chairs and the comforting scent of old paper. She was reading a book, her hair loose, her face free of makeup. A woman at a nearby table glanced at her, then did a double take. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice low, filled not with pity or morbid curiosity, but with a deep, quiet respect. Alara looked up, her dark eyes meeting the woman's. She thought for a moment, not about the wedding, the scandal, or the fallen empire. She thought of the girl in the simple dress, the daughter who had honored her father's lesson, the woman who had refused to let the world define her worth. "I'm just Alara," she said, and a real smile, bright and warm and full of promise, lit up her face. The woman smiled back, an unspoken understanding passing between them. At a charity fundraiser a year later, a businessman, some former friend of Corbin's, tried to corner a group of reporters, boasting that the Ashworths would bounce back. As he spoke, his phone buzzed. His face went pale. His own company's stock had just tanked, a casualty of its ties to the Ashworths' collapsed deals. The reporters turned away, leaving him to his ruin. Alara wasn't there, but her shadow was long. She didn't need to be in the room to win anymore. The world kept turning, but for many, something had shifted. People spoke of Alara Vance not as a victim, not as a bride, but as a force. She had walked through fire and emerged, not just untouched, but forged anew in the flames. She hadn't destroyed the Ashworths. She had simply held up a mirror, and they had been shattered by their own reflection. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her steps were steady, her head high, and the future was an open, unwritten page. She had always been enough.